Dorian Bennett had been waiting for over an hour and a half when the CEO finally walked in, setting everything into motion. The automatic doors of Highland Crest Bank slid open, releasing a burst of cool, conditioned air onto the sidewalk. The crisp scent of freshly brewed coffee blended with the soft polish of leather furniture, filling the air with an aura of calm efficiency. Dorian stepped through the door, adjusting his shoulders beneath his well-fitted blazer. He wasn't anxious. He had been in enough boardrooms, closed enough deals, and built enough from the ground up to know he had earned his place in any room. What he needed now was for them to recognize it. His meeting was scheduled for exactly 11 a.m. He had no reason to expect anything other than professionalism. The lobby was a refined mix of modern luxury and traditional elegance, with mahogany desks, sleek glass partitions, and golden accents that shimmered in the light, reminding anyone who entered that wealth was at home here. The space was designed to make an impression. Behind the desk, a receptionist with a neatly pinned bun and an air of indifference glanced up as he walked in. Her nameplate read, Melissa. "Welcome to Highland Crest Bank," she said, her voice automatic. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm Dorian Bennett," he replied, placing his leather portfolio on the counter. "I have a meeting with Linda Kramer at 11 o'clock. Melissa's fingers tapped the keyboard as she checked the screen. "You're on the schedule," she said, her tone unchanged. "Have a seat. She'll be with you soon." Dorian nodded and moved to the seating area, choosing a chair near the large windows. The sunlight streamed in, casting sharp lines across the polished floors. A group of well-dressed professionals chatted casually about market shifts and investment opportunities. The kind of talk you heard when people felt at ease, when they belonged. He tapped his fingers lightly on his briefcase. It was 10 a.m. He was always early. The minutes slipped by, and at 11:05 he tried to let it go. Banks, after all, weren't immune to delays. But by 11:20, his patience began to wane, and he started watching the flow of people more closely. A man in a gray suit, perhaps in his early 30s, checked in with Melissa. Less than 5 minutes later, a young banker appeared and led him through the frosted glass doors to the executive offices. Then, a woman in a cream-colored blazer arrived. Dorian noticed she had no appointment. She exchanged a few friendly words with Melissa before being escorted inside as well. Meanwhile, Dorian's name had still not been called. He checked his watch again. 11:30 a.m. Something didn't feel right. Dorian's fingers drummed lightly against his briefcase as he watched people come and go. Some walked in with the confidence of those who knew they belonged. Easy smiles, familiar nods, and handshakes exchanged with the staff. Others, like him, sat quietly waiting for their turn. The difference was clear. They were being called. He wasn't. He had been sitting here for 35 minutes. His appointment had been scheduled. He had confirmed it twice. And yet he remained in the same chair while at least 6 others who had arrived after him walked in and disappeared behind the frosted glass doors leading to the executive offices. Still, he kept his composure. He'd dealt with this kind of thing before, subtle, unspoken barriers that people could easily deny. "Oh, we didn't mean to keep you waiting," they'd say. "It must have been a scheduling mix-up," or "So sorry about that, you know how busy we get." Excuses wrapped in politeness. Dorian stood up, keeping his expression neutral, and walked back to the front desk. Melissa barely looked up, her face unchanged. "Excuse me," Dorian said, his voice calm but firm. "Has Linda Kramer been made aware that I'm waiting?" Melissa let out a short breath, as though she had been interrupted mid-thought. She tapped at the keyboard in front of her without meeting his eyes. "She knows. She's just finishing up with another client." Dorian waited, expecting some kind of follow-up, an acknowledgement that she would check again, or maybe an updated time. Instead, Melissa simply went back to typing. "Do you have an estimate on when she'll be available?" Dorian asked, holding back his frustration. Melissa barely glanced at the screen before shrugging. "It shouldn't be much longer." Dorian exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. It wasn't just what she had said. It was how she said it. No urgency, no real effort to check. Just another dismissive response meant to pacify him. And then right in front of him, he saw it happen again. A woman in a navy blue dress walked in, her designer handbag swinging at her side. She was talking on the phone, her voice light and easy. Melissa's posture changed instantly. Her tone softened, and her lips curved into a smile that actually seemed genuine. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster," she said, her voice warmer, more polished. The woman gave a polite nod, barely pausing before a young banker appeared at her side, ushering her toward the back offices. No waiting, no questions, no being told soon. Dorian exhaled slowly. He had been here for almost an hour, and she had been here for less than a minute. He turned back to Melissa. "So, do appointments matter here, or is it just first come, first served?" For the first time, he could see the discomfort on her face. "I told you, sir. She'll be with you soon." There it was again. Soon. A delay without a deadline. A promise without any real commitment. A word that allowed them to pretend they weren't doing what they were clearly doing. Dorian glanced back at the frosted glass doors. It would be easy to let it slide, sit back down, wait another 30 minutes and pretend this wasn't happening. But this wasn't just about waiting. It was about something far deeper. He forced himself to sit back down, trying to stay calm. He'd faced worse. He'd built a company from the ground up, dealt with condescending investors, been underestimated in rooms full of men who thought they knew better. But this was different. It wasn't about his business plan or numbers on a spreadsheet. This was about being ignored, about being dismissed as if he wasn't even worth an update. He checked his watch. 12:05 p.m. Over an hour now. He took a deep breath and looked around the lobby again. No one else was waiting. Every person who had walked in after him had been attended to, ushered inside, or at least acknowledged, except for him. Across the room, a young teller was chatting with an older man in khakis and a golf polo. Their conversation was light, easy, casual. "Yeah, I told her to just walk in," the older man chuckled. "She doesn't even need an appointment. You know how it is." The teller laughed. "Well, for Mrs. Lancaster, we always make exceptions." Dorian's grip tightened around the handle of his briefcase. So that was how it worked. Rules for some, different rules for others. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the polished floors. This was a test. Would he sit here quietly, accept being pushed aside, and wait for permission to be seen? Or would he make it clear that his time was just as valuable as anyone else's? He stood, not in haste, not aggressively, just decisively. He walked past the front desk, past Melissa's blank expression, and headed straight for the frosted glass doors. "Sir," Melissa started, but he didn't stop. He pushed open the door. A hallway stretched out before Dorian, lined with private offices. Some doors were open, others closed, but one thing became immediately clear. Linda Kramer was not in a meeting. She was sitting at her desk, typing away on her laptop, alone. When she looked up, her expression shifted from surprise to irritation in an instant. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice sharp, "you should have waited to be called." Dorian met her gaze without flinching. "I did wait." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Please take a seat," she finally said. Dorian sat down, not because she had given him permission, but because he chose to. Something told him that this conversation wasn't going to go the way she expected. Linda's fingers twitched slightly as she adjusted the papers on her desk, her face carefully neutral. But Dorian could see it, the subtle tension in her jaw, the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "I apologize for the delay," she said, forcing a smile. "We've been extremely busy today." Busy? Dorian let the word hang in the air for a moment. He had watched at least 6 people walk past him like VIPs while he sat in that lobby for over an hour and a half. "Were you?" he asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. "Because I counted a few clients who didn't have to wait at all, some without appointments." Linda's lips tightened into a thin line. "I assure you, Mr. Bennett, that wasn't intentional. There must have been a miscommunication." "Right, a miscommunication." Dorian exhaled through his nose, keeping his expression unreadable. "Interesting." Linda cleared her throat, clearly eager to move past the conversation. She flipped open a folder, scanning its contents. "Now, let's discuss your loan application," she said, her voice regaining that polished, dismissive edge. "I've had a chance to review it, and while your finances are impressive, we do have strict criteria for approvals. Given the current lending climate, I'm afraid we'll need more assurances before we can proceed." Before she could finish her sentence, the door swung open. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The hallway, which had been quiet moments ago, was now filled with the low hum of voices. But these weren't just any voices, they carried weight. 3 men stepped inside, all in tailored suits. Their presence was unmistakably authoritative. Dorian didn't need to guess who they were. These were the people who actually mattered at this bank, the executives, the decision makers, the kind of men whose approval meant everything in a place like this. And at the front of them was a familiar face, Richard Langford, the CEO of Highland Crest Bank, and a man who knew exactly who Dorian was. Richard's sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Dorian, his face lighting up with recognition. "Dorian," he said, breaking into a smile. "What the hell are you doing here?" Linda froze. Dorian stood and shook Richard's hand firmly. "Hey, Richard, been a while." "It has," Richard replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "You still running Bennett's strategies?" "Still growing it," Dorian responded smoothly. Linda watched them, her fingers tightening around the folder in front of her. Richard turned, his smile fading slightly as he looked at her. "How long has Dorian been waiting?" he asked. Silence. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dorian didn't answer immediately. He let it sit, letting the weight of it hang in the air, over her, over the entire room. "About an hour and a half," he said finally. Richard's face didn't change much, not in any dramatic way, but Dorian noticed the way his jaw ticked slightly. "An hour and a half?" Richard repeated, his tone deceptively light. "You had Dorian Bennett waiting for an hour and a half?" Linda scrambled for words. There was a scheduling issue. Richard didn't even glance at her. His attention remained solely on Dorian. "You should have called me directly," Richard said. "I would have made sure you were taken care of." Dorian offered a small, knowing smile. "Didn't think I needed to." Richard exhaled, shaking his head. He turned to Linda, his smile now completely gone. "Linda," he said, his voice calm but final, "step outside for a moment." Linda's face turned a shade paler than before. Her hands clenched into fists before she unclenched them. "Of course," she said, standing quickly and exiting without another word. The moment the door clicked shut, Richard turned back to Dorian, shaking his head again. "I don't know what happened," he said, "but I guarantee it won't happen again." Dorian didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The door clicked shut behind Linda, but the tension in the room lingered. Richard let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he took a seat across from Dorian. The other 2 executives stood nearby, exchanging glances but saying nothing. "This isn't how we do things here," Richard said. Richard spoke finally, his tone steady but clipped. "This isn't how we do things here." Dorian tilted his head slightly. "Seems like it is." Richard let that hang in the air for a moment. He didn't argue, didn't try to make excuses. Men like him, men who sat at the top, knew when something had gone wrong. And right now, he was calculating exactly how big of a problem this was. Dorian wasn't just any walk-in client. He had built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from the ground up. His reputation carried weight in business circles. He knew people who trusted his word. And now he had a story. Richard sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Tell me what happened. Dorian didn't sugarcoat it. He told him everything. The appointment, the wait, watching others get taken in before him. He told him about Melissa's dismissive attitude, Linda's indifference, the way she tried to brush him off like he was just another name on a list. Richard didn't interrupt. The other two executives listened just as intently. When Dorian finished, the silence stretched for a moment before Richard exhaled. I appreciate you telling me, he said, and I'll be honest, I'm pissed. Dorian leaned back slightly. Why? Richard let out a short, humorless chuckle. Because this is the kind of thing that wrecks reputations. We've worked too damn hard to build this institution's credibility. And now, I have to clean up a mess I didn't even know existed. He turned to one of the executives. Make sure Linda is off the floor immediately. We'll have a conversation later. The man nodded and stepped out without another word. Richard turned back to Dorian. That loan application you submitted, I assume it was solid? Dorian tapped his briefcase. See for yourself. Richard took the folder and flipped through it. He barely made it through the first few pages before shaking his head. This shouldn't have even been a question. He glanced at one of the remaining executives. Fast track it. I want an approval on my desk by the end of the day. Dorian raised an eyebrow. Just like that? Richard met his gaze. You should have had it 2 hours ago. I'm fixing the mistake. Dorian considered that. This wasn't about generosity. It wasn't about making things right. It was about control, about damage, about ensuring that the story stopped here, in this office, before it bled into places Richard didn't want it to reach. And Dorian understood that game better than anyone. Still, he wasn't about to let Richard off that easy. I'll accept the approval, Dorian said, standing. But fixing this for me doesn't fix the real issue, Dorian said, his voice steady. Richard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. We'll be having a long conversation about that, he said. Dorian grabbed his briefcase, nodding once before heading toward the door. But before he left, he made sure to meet Melissa's gaze one last time. She didn't look nearly as confident now. The summer heat pressed against Dorian's skin as he stepped outside. The bank's pristine exterior gleamed under the midday sun, but inside, the cracks had already begun to show. This wasn't just about a loan. It wasn't even just about Linda. It was about something bigger, something that had played out in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different places. It wasn't always loud, it wasn't always overt, but it was there. The assumption that some people belonged in those offices while others had to wait. The quiet dismissals, the polite rejections, the carefully constructed barriers that could always be explained away. But not today. Today, someone had to face the consequences. And the next time Linda Kramer looked at a name on her appointment list, she'd think twice. Dorian checked his phone, an email, loan approved. He smirked, tucking the phone into his pocket as he walked toward his car. Respect isn't given, it's demanded, he thought. And today, he got what he came for. If you've ever been in a situation like this, where you've been made to feel like your time, your presence, your business wasn't valued, speak up. Don't wait for permission. Take your seat at the table. And if they try to keep you waiting, make sure they remember why that was a mistake.